But Richard, if you want to have a word here, you know, it would be appropriate. Yes.
So maybe we should then have been clearer, or I should have been clearer in writing up my earlier papers. So you're right, the Grice doesn't talk about ostension, but I also think that there's an entirely reasonable way to read your and Deirdre's development of the idea of ostension as substituting for his second clause in a way that is entirely consistent with what he's doing. So, but in that case, I think the debt that's owed is just is citing you as the originators of this term rather than Grice, which actually I think people in the literature have done. I don't think that there's a discontinuity in the thought here, though. I think there's a bigger discontinuity in the rejection of the third clause and the showing, which I think is a clearer distinction between you and Grice. But also most Griceans, since Stephen Neal's 1991 paper, I don't think anyone is really invested in the third clause anymore. It looks like using a hammer to crack a nut, and it has far more negative consequences than it does positive ones.
And he himself was not that convinced. I mean, he himself was aware of objection. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah. So one way to put the general point I'm trying to make, and thanks for your comments, is you may say also, relevance theory with the theory of ostension is Grice and with lots of quotes in the following sense. This is what Grice should have written. Okay, but you wouldn't agree. So let me move to the where this things change too easily. So we were attention in Grice, and now we meta communication and meta representational mentalization. So no question was formulated like that, but I think this is what is at issue. And let me to begin with read again what is in blue on the screen. A quote from our article: an ostensive stimulus presents targeted individuals not only with information about some situation, but also with the information that they are being addressed by a communicator who is calling for their attention and involvement. This meta-communicative feature is a defining feature of ostension. And we spend some time trying to explain that, and I think in the revision we should even underscore it better, that meta-communication does not require meta-representation. I mean, you can understand that an action is an action of communication aimed at you without meta-representing the intention of a communicator, just as you can, and other animals do and so on, but humans do all the time also, you can recognize an action. If you're a human, once you recognize an action that is something that has a goal, you can attribute a mental state to the agent, to have that the agent probably has some mental representation of a goal, but you needn't. And so other animals that don't meta-represent can recognize actions and react on their basis. And so what they recognize is something that indeed is governed by the intention, but they don't have to attribute the intention. All they have to do is categorize the action. And the categorization of the action, there may be, it's a predicate which may have arguments. Fine, so it's an action directed at an object or at an individual, and so that's fine. But still, no meta-representation involved. So for humans, of course, it gives room for meta-representational inference very immediately, but that doesn't mean that we do it all the time. So here are the two questions which this consideration should help us answer. So Eduardo writes, it seems to me that by pointing out that detecting ostension, i.e. recognizing communicative intent, well, okay, just notice, that's, no, detecting ostension, we suggest, can be done without recognizing communicative intent. You don't need any sense of intent to just as recognizing hunting doesn't recognizing the intention to catch a prey or kill a prey. If you're a human being, you can indeed translate that into intentional language, but you needn't. So by pointing out that detecting ostension does not require mentalization nor meta-representation, so it seems to me that by pointing out detecting ostension does not require mentalization or meta-representation, the authors lean towards a more frugal approach regarding the meta-representational burden of ostensive communication. Let me put another parenthesis. We're not motivated by the notion that meta-representation is particularly burdensome. Our account of comprehension based on ostension involves much less representational work than does the Grayson account if you take it as an account of a cognitive process rather than as a rational reconstruction. But the conclusion of attributing a meaning to a communicator is attributing a Grice meaning that is an intention in our account. So it's just less use of meta-representation arriving at this attribution, but its meta-representation is still the outcome. More generally speaking, the notion that meta-representation is more costly than anything else, it's not, there's nothing obvious about it. In fact, it's easy enough to find cases where it's easier to meta-represent than to infer in a non-meta-representational manner and so on. So that's, it's a bit like, assuming that having doubts that it's more work to see in colors. So probably when we don't need to, we see in black and white and we just look at colors when we need to. Well, no. Some things turn out to be quite cheap. Of course, it's more complex to see colors, but the mechanism that does it doesn't consume more energy, which is what matters. Okay, let me continue. Sorry, Eduardo, for putting parentheses in your question. However, Eduardo writes, they are still committed. They are still committed to the idea that the communicative intention is the higher order layer of a specific mental state that is meta-represented by the addressee. And in parentheses, if I read it properly, the frugal claim about detecting ostension should stand independently from the proposed distinction between basic and mentalistic ostension, which instead refers to the method employed by the addressee to retrieve evidence from the communicated content. If I understand you well, I don't agree. That's not really what we think. Indeed, the basic idea is that what defines ostension is the meta-communicative aspect. Meta-representation occurs only in meta-representations, in mentalizing ostension. But ostension is defined by the fact, basically, that you are addressing, the communicator is addressing an addressee then, who has to recognize that he is being addressed. That's it. So that he is the object of a certain type of action, the target of a certain kind of action. And that's true of ostension generally. So detecting ostension is done by detecting that the communicator is addressing you, full stop. And that doesn't involve meta-representation. And so that is directly related to the distinction between basic and mentalistic ostension, because that's enough for basic ostension and not enough for mentalistic ostension. In purely basic ostension, all you need is indeed to understand that the communicator is addressing you, and then you look at the evidence provided, and that evidence provides you with relevant information as expected. If it's mentalistic, then you have to mentalize. If it's mentalizing. So, Eduardo, if you want to maybe reply, add, correct.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can't see you, but I can hear you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
I can hear. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much for picking up this question. Yeah, my question was more related to the different layers of the outcome of the interpretative process.
Yeah.
So by assuming that detecting ostension, here in parentheses, I put it, recognizing communicative intent by drawing more on a perspective, developmental perspective, such as Gergo early view. For which detecting ostension amounts to recognize the communicative intent. So I was wondering whether in case of basic ostension and even in mentalistic ostension, where you basically recognize the action as ostensive, meta-communicative, without any kind of mentalization process,
Mm,
there
yeah.
could be differences in the meta-representational output of the interpretation process, because technically speaking, it seems to me that by putting away the higher order layer of the communicative intention, assuming that meta-communicative aspect can be simply detected and decoded, we in the outcome, we don't need a higher order meta-representational folk, such as the one classically, standardly proposed by yourself as well.
So it seems are we agreeing that in basic ostension, meta-representation has no role to play or not? I mean, again, if you're a human being, you can, just as you can always meta-represent the intention of an agent, because if you understand what kind of action it is, but it's not necessary to understand to benefit from a basic ostension.
Yeah, but for what concern mentalistic extension, why should we need a higher order intention? If we can individuate the higher order by simply detecting an action as meta-communicative.
So in the mentalistic ostension, the evidence that's provided doesn't identify the information. It's not evidence of the information that is relevant to you, that can convey. So you have to go through her mind, so to speak, to get evidence, interpretation evidence of information being communicated.
But shouldn't that be evidence for the informative intention instead of the communicative intention? So observational evidence for the informative intention.
Yes, and the informative intention is embedded in the communicative intentions. I mean, of course, it's she has that informative intention, and that's what makes her a communicator, because she's trying to achieve it through a communicative means, in this case, for ostension. So yes, there's a whole layer of complexity that we do not discuss in this paper, and which has to do with the fact that communication, typical mentalistic communication, also establish a common ground of mutual manifestness, and doing so may contribute to its expected relevance, and therefore that may become part of what's being communicated, and so on. So we didn't go into all this aspect, which is quite important in pragmatics in general, and which has indeed origin in the discussion of Christ. Christ himself didn't accept the notion of Strawson's notion of overtness quite. I mean, he was reluctant about it. But it's been part of the game, and we have our own answer to that. So we leave that aspect of things aside, and you can have both mentalistic and basic or basic ostension, which contributes to relevance because of the social aspects on top of that, and which therefore typically will elicit mentalization. Does that help?
Yeah. I think it definitely answers to my question.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm glad I have. Okay. Let me then proceed. Where were we? Yes, Stavros, question.